Good day one and all. In today's video I have a very cool vintage audio electronic device to show you. This is a Sony model TC-110A cassette recorder made in 1971, give or take a year. Most sources I look at say that this particular model was made in 1971 and 1972. One source I looked at said that it was introduced in 1970, so 1971, give or take a year, is what I'm sticking with. I bought this at a thrift store in the United States a few weeks ago. Mom and I took we did a road trip into Machias, Maine, a quaint little town, couple thousand people. We've only been there once before, and we just had a blast. And the reason we had a blast is because Machias, Maine has two of some of the greatest thrift stores that we've ever seen. One is called Bag of Rags, and sadly they're closing in December unless they can find someone else to take it over. Bag of Rags is amazing. It's basically a massive house that was converted into a multi-room thrift store, so the place is like a maze, and there's just something different in every room, and you'll wonder if you're ever going to reach the end of it. And then the other thrift store is where I found this thing. It was basically like a barn that was converted into a thrift store, and it's all dark and dingy and dirty, and it's friggin' awesome. And that's where I found this thing, and I paid $2 for it, which is pretty sweet. And yeah, I would highly recommend, if you're ever in the state of Maine, take a trip through Machias. It's a neat little town, and very easy to drive to as well. It's right on US Route 1, and when you come from Canada, you're already on US Route 1, so you literally just drive for 90 minutes on Route 1, and then you're there. You never have to turn onto another road. So yeah, really enjoyed it. So anyway, I saw this on a shelf in the second thrift store we went into for $2, and despite its very cheap price, I actually second-guessed buying it. And the reason I second-guessed buying it is because I've recently had a very poor and frustrating experience with a vintage cassette recorder that I bought on eBay, with the hopes that it would work. It came not working, and I tried to fix it, and I ended up making it even worse. I think I posted this on my Facebook page, The Maritime Girl. I bought a Realistic Mini Set 6 on eBay, portable cassette recorder from like the late 1970s. In the box, really good condition. I got it and it played just fine, but it wouldn't record. The record signal was extremely weak. I bought all the replacement electrolytic capacitors on DigiKey, which cost me like $15. I replaced all the electrolytic capacitors, which was very hard to do because the board was tied down by a multitude of wires. And when I put it back together, not only was it not any better, but it stopped recording altogether. Now there was zero sound coming and going onto the tape and recording instead of very little sound. So that was such a frustrating and disappointing experience that I almost second-guessed buying this thing, because it's like, it's another cassette recorder. After the horrible experience I had trying to restore the last one I bought, do I really want to go through it again? Well, I'm really happy to say that this thing actually works just fine. All I had to do was replace a couple of belts in it, and it works just fine. Coming on 50 years old, it's got all the original capacitors, and it is working great. There's nothing really wrong with it at all. After replacing two belts, it's mechanically just fine, and it electronically seems very strong, so that's awesome. So I'm really happy I bought this. I'm done with the Realistic Mini Set 6. I will never make a video about it. I'm just going to throw it back on eBay, and I don't think I'm going to get back what I paid for it, but I just really want to get it out of my hands. But anyway, this really saved grace, finding this thing and discovering that it works just fine. It really helped boost my morale there. So this is a really interesting cassette recorder. It is, for all intents and purposes, just an ordinary shoebox cassette recorder, and there are millions of those. I think probably all of us, at least people my age and older, have probably had experience using a shoebox cassette recorder at some point in its life. But this one's kind of interesting. Obviously it's a very early cassette recorder, 1971 give or take, but this was actually Sony's second ever cassette recorder, second ever compact cassette recorder. This was a revision to Sony's first compact cassette recorder, which was the TC-100, which, if I remember correctly, was introduced in 1968. Now this unit, the TC-110A, was basically just a revision of the TC-100. Among other changes, it added the built-in microphone, which you can see right here. TC-100 didn't have a built-in microphone, this does. But the actual physical design and construction is exactly the same as the TC-100, so the physical design of this thing dates back to 1968, 50 years, and that, I think, is really cool. This was also one of the first cassette recorders to use the piano key transport controls. The compact cassette was invented by Philips in the early 1960s, and Philips's early cassette recorders, which were shoebox units, which were sold in North America under the Norelco brand name because Philips couldn't legally use the Philips name in North America at that time. They used a little joystick control. It was basically a little joystick. Like you pressed it down for play and left for rewind and right for fast forward. And Sony was one of the first, if not the first, to replace that with piano key controls, which is obviously the standard that has stuck ever since. Interestingly, kind of amusingly, one of Sony's later cassette recorders, which was called the TC-12, I believe, and it was from, I think, the mid-1970s, it actually used a joystick control, and actually it was very similar mechanically to the early Norelco Philips cassette recorders. The TC-12 was meant to be a very cheap budget model, and so Sony basically ripped off Norelco's design from the 60s and just called it a day with that, which is pretty amusing. What's very cool though is that although this is a shoebox cassette recorder, and today we associate shoebox cassette recorders with being, you know, cheap, low-end cassette recorders, and Walmart sold a shoebox cassette recorder under the RCA name until just a few years ago, this thing is actually extremely well built and very high quality. Remember, this was Sony's second ever cassette recorder, so obviously they did not try to cheap out on it, and in fact Sony sold this as a high-end cassette recorder, something that could be used for professional use, not for studio music recording, obviously. You gotta remember, at the time that this was made, the compact cassette was not yet accepted as a viable high-fidelity audio format, for example, for music. It was only seen as good quality enough for dictation purposes. But Sony designed and marketed this particular recorder as a high-end recorder, and it is extremely well built. It's well built inside, and the recording quality of this thing is very, very good for what it is. In fact, I was astounded. I did not expect the sound quality that I got out of this thing when I tested it for the first time. I tested it on the original belts. The original belts were just barely serviceable. And I stuck in a tape and made a recording, and when I played it back, I was just blown away. This thing, for how old it is, and for how early it was in the compact cassette's life, makes very good recordings. Not music quality, obviously not something even approaching the level of, for example, my Iowa 80 F770. But for what it was, and for what people expected of the compact cassette at the time, this thing was a very high quality cassette recorder. So what makes it so high quality? Well, first of all, this does have AC bias recording. Now, I'm not going to go into what bias means. You can look that up if you want to, but basically, well, I can do a high level explanation. Bias basically is a bias signal is a high frequency signal way far above the range of human hearing, that's recorded onto a magnetic tape in addition to the audio signal itself. The bias signal is used to randomize the magnetic particles on the tape, make them random, which better prepares them to receive an audio signal. The very earliest magnetic tape recorders, going back to the 30s and 40s, did not use bias, and as a result, a very strong and loud signal had to be recorded onto the tape to be audible on playback. And then they discovered when you took a really high frequency signal and recorded it onto the tape in addition to the audio signal, that high frequency recording better prepared the magnetic particles for reception of the audio signal, which meant that the audio signal made it onto the tape a lot better, and it was a lot louder and better fidelity upon playback. But there's two types of bias. There's AC bias and DC bias. Basically, the bias signal could be DC or AC. The very earliest compact cassette recorders used DC bias. Later ones used AC bias, but very cheap recorders, even going into recent decades, might use DC bias. And AC bias produces much better audio quality. This is an AC bias recorder, which is very nice. I wasn't sure what it would be because this, is fairly early, but it is in fact AC bias, so that's very nice to know. Perhaps the TC-100 was DC bias, and that was one of the revisions that this model made to the TC-100. So that's one of the things that make this a really nice, good quality recorder. AC bias recording, very good. Second of all, this thing is extremely heavy. If I remember right, the specified weight is like 3.5 pounds, and I would assume that was before batteries and cassette, so a dry weight of 3.5 pounds, which is quite amazing. All the materials seem very good. The plastic seems pretty good. It doesn't flex or anything like that. The only sort of not great part of the construction is that the battery compartment, which is right here, which is held on by this latch, the battery compartment moves a little bit. You can see it flops around just a tiny bit, but it's by no means loose or at risk of falling off or anything. So that's the only thing. But the plastic itself seems quite firm, very good quality. A far cry from the realistic Miniset 6, which felt quite flimsy in comparison. Now another thing is that the top half of it here, this is metal. This is actual metal, and it's pretty thick metal, as you can see. Although unfortunately, this is not a structural part of the case of this recorder. This is more or less decorative. It removes with 2 screws on this side and 2 screws on this side, and underneath is just plastic covering all the same pieces. And actually something I thought kind of funny is when you remove this metal part, it looks just like a cheaper shoebox cassette recorder underneath. But the fact that they took the time to put this here, and it's real metal and it's quite thick, is very nice, and I'm sure it adds at least a little bit of durability to it. This metal frame is also here because it's got these 2 lugs here where you would attach a shoulder strap to, which I don't have. Oh well. But yeah, that's at any rate is very nice attention to quality there. Another attention to quality is that this printing on here, like the labeling for the buttons and the Sony and where it says IC solid state, this is actually stamped into the metal. It's not just printed on top. This is stamped into the metal. You can physically feel it when you run your finger over it, so that's not going to wear off. So that's very cool. And as you can see, it advertises IC solid state. This is obviously a solid state device. And it does have one integrated circuit in it. I forget what it's for, but it does have one integrated circuit in it. So that's kind of interesting, sort of ahead of its time in that regard. And then I guess the final mark of quality in this recorder is simply how good it sounds. Playback quality is very good, recording quality is very good. It is a very, very nice recorder. Especially when you consider that after the 80s, shoebox recorders became quite cheap. devices that for a lot of recorders didn't make very good sounding recordings at all. It's got a big speaker right here for playback. It sounds excellent. It gets very loud. Looking over this thing a bit more, it's got review but no cue, and there was a few recorders that were like that at the time, just I guess a thing they didn't think they needed at the time. It's got a tape counter, which is quite nice. It's got a little reset button for it there. And it's got this meter, this mechanical little needle meter. This serves two purposes. When you're recording, it's a level meter, so when you speak, the needle moves to show that you're modulating. And on playback, it's a battery meter. Basically, if the needle's pointing into the black area, your batteries are good. If it's going into the red area, your batteries are low. This blue piece here is part of the plastic. There's your built-in microphone. It's an electret condenser microphone. That is your eject lever. When you press that, the door pops up. You get volume and tone controls, very nice. And look at this. This is something that newer shoebox recorders do not have. This has 4 jacks on it. It's got 2 inputs for line in and microphone. It's got a monitor jack, which is a mono headphone jack. And it's got a remote jack if you had a microphone with a remote on it, so you could stop and start the recording using the remote. You do not see shoebox recorders with, you see just only a few of them with a microphone input. You definitely don't see them with a line input. So that's very, very cool. And it shows how Sony marketed this to be, you know, a high-end recorder for, you know, professional use. That is a power plug. It's got 4 pins on it. 2 pins would be to supply AC power. So you can power this with 120 volts AC. It's got a built-in power supply to convert it down to the low voltage DC. You couldn't pay me to plug AC voltage into this with those 50-year-old capacitors, some of which are part of the power supply circuitry. I definitely would not try powering this with AC right now. And then the other 2 pins, probably the bottom 2, are for 6 volts DC if you had a DC power supply to plug into this. And I don't have those cables, obviously. It was UL listed. And that's it on the top and sides. Going around the bottom, Sony Tapecorder TC-110A. Sony sold all their magnetic tape audio recorders under the Tapecorder name, including the cassette recorders. 117 volts, 60 hertz, 3 watts, or DC 6 volts. For batteries, 4 C size batteries, and you certainly don't see a lot of stuff that uses C batteries anymore. I think I have all of 4 devices that use C batteries. Serial number is there. You can't see it very well, but it is stamped in there. And of course, this was made in Tokyo, Japan. And this is old enough. It was back in the time when Sony's equipment was distributed by a North American company called Superscope. And that's how Sony's products became introduced to North America. This company Superscope would import Sony stuff from Japan and sell it by themselves. And that's how we discovered Sony's beautiful products. Battery compartment's right here, as I showed before. There's a little latch you pull back and it tilts up and out of the way. And the batteries are housed in this box. And the reason it's this way is because there was a rechargeable battery that you could put in here instead of having to use primary batteries. You'll notice there are 3 prongs for the battery compartment here because one of them is the charge output if you were using a rechargeable battery. This primary battery box obviously only has 2 contacts on it. And if you were plugged into external AC or DC power, it would charge the battery pack. That is the coil for the speaker that's in this thing. And from what I can tell, I think the speaker that's in this thing is the same speaker that Sony used for a lot of their reel-to-reel tape recorders. So big speaker. Very nice. And you open the door on the battery compartment, and there's your 4 C batteries. A little bit of corrosion in the battery compartment, very old corrosion, and nothing detrimental. Everything is a-okay. You put the battery compartment back in, just pivot it into place. And there you go. Up here, it's got a cool little badge that says cassette-corder. And there used to be some lettering on the top of the cassette door here. That is gone now because I actually used Novus plastic polish to polish up this door. This door was really hazed and scratched up. It was actually pretty hard to see the cassette inside. So I actually bought a Novus plastic polish kit, which I've been wanting for years. And this was one of my first subjects that I tested on. And it came out beautifully, very clear, no scratches or very few scratches in it now. But the consequence was I wiped off some lettering that was at the top here. Now you won't be able to see it on camera, but I can just barely see it still, the imprint, the outline of where the lettering was. But it said cassette-corder electret condenser microphone. That's what it said. So I could have tried to preserve the lettering, but I really just wanted to get this door nice and shiny. I don't feel too bad. It was a trade-off, but I think it was a good trade-off. So how about we test this thing? So I have a cassette here ready to go. I have this Sony HF cassette, just a garden variety cheap cassette. I chose it for no other reason than it's transparent, and I figure some people might appreciate being able to see the cassette reels spinning inside. So we open the little door, and you just push the cassette inside, snaps into place. And you can actually use this thing with the door open. Press the eject button and you can just use this thing with the door open. But you might wonder, how do you get the cassette out? Do you have to just pry it out? Well, I wasn't sure at first either. But then I realized, I paid a bit more attention, and I noticed you push the eject button in to open the door, but when you shove it to the left afterwards, it throws the tape out very violently, which I think is hilarious. So that's how you eject it. So I can show you the rewind and fast forward here. My batteries are on the verge of getting low, but it's still working just fine. And this thing's really nice, as you can see. It's got a really strong fast forward and really strong rewind. And you can see the tape counter moving there. Reset button works. Very, very nice. Very fast and good torque on the rewind and fast forward. No auto stop, either when rewinding or playing. There is no auto stop. So I had to replace 2 of the belts on this thing. This thing has 3 belts, one of which is used for the tape counter. I didn't have to touch that one. The tape counter is working fine. The other 2 belts, one is the capstan belt, obviously, and the other is the rewind and fast forward belt. Both of them were quite loose. The rewind and fast forward belt was especially floppy. This thing did not want to rewind or fast forward at all, and playback and recording just barely worked. This thing uses 2 square belts, and I have a square belt kit that I bought on eBay for like 99 cents from China a while back, and luckily I had 2 belts that fit just perfectly. One of them was easy to get on. The other one required a little bit of dexterity because it was the pulleys that it goes on were under a circuit board, but I got it on eventually. And yeah, this thing is mechanically just fine now. Now, although this kind of neat, although this thing doesn't have automatic stop, it does have, if I press play here to raise the playheads, if you look at these 2 metal prongs right here, Sony manufactured cassettes that had an end of tape alert in the form of a metal foil strip at the end of the tape, at the leader. And when you played a tape in a machine that supported these special tapes, which this one does, when you got to the end of the tape and the foil ran across these metal fingers right here, it would activate a circuit that emits a gross buzzing sound through the speaker. And I can demonstrate that. I'll just take a screwdriver here, and maybe you have to be recording. Let me hold the record protect tab with my finger so I can put it in record mode. Okay, so we're now in record mode of Tape, and when I speak you could see the record meter modulate. Oh, this thing has automatic level control, by the way, which Sony back in this day called Sony-matic. That's what they called their auto level control functionality. And maybe now, when I short out those contacts, yeah, there you go. Evidently the record meter reacts to that. And I'm noticing now that it's not reacting to my voice anymore. That's interesting. It must shut itself off when when the end of tape alarm sounds. That's what it sounds like anyway. Pretty gross sound. Very rudimentary oscillator circuit in there. And I find it kind of interesting that the meter isn't modulating anymore. So if now you can actually, yeah, there you see it's working again. When you have a tape in, and if the right protect isn't broken off, you can actually hit record alone and it doesn't move the tape, but it activates all the audio sensing circuitry. So you can just hit record, and before you start recording you can make sure that you're modulating and everything, which is useful if you have, say, an external microphone that you're using and you just want to make sure your microphone's going to pick up whatever you want to record. So that's cool. So how about I shut up and we test this thing, we demonstrate it, and I'll show you how the audio quality is. So we'll stick our tape in. I'm going to do a recording. I will test with the built-in microphone, and I'm also going to test with an external microphone, which I'll be using the Olympus LS7 as an external microphone. It'll be plugged in to the line input because I don't own an actual microphone. I should get an actual microphone someday. Now, something I've noticed right before beginning to film this video is I did a test between the two microphones, and I noticed that the internal microphone, well, not only was it obviously of not as good quality as an external microphone, but I notice now when I make recordings with the internal microphone, there's this high-pitched sort of scratchiness in my voice on the recording when I use the internal microphone, but not an external microphone. And I don't remember it being like that before. I remember recordings with the internal microphone being just excellent, nothing wrong with them at all. Recently I used compressed air on this thing just to blow all the dust off it and stuff, and I you know, presumably would have gotten some of it into the internal microphone. I'm actually wondering if I might have damaged the internal microphone with compressed air. I hope that's not the case. Maybe it was always this way and I just don't remember. I don't know. But yeah, it seems to me that the internal microphone is not working as well as it used to. But with that said, let's begin our recording. This is a test of the Sony model TC-110A cassette recorder from 1971, give or take a year. Using the built-in microphone, you can see the needle swinging to my voice there. And if I actually pick this thing up and put it over here, and I go back to where I was, now this is a test speaking to the recorder from across the room, some 6 or 8 feet away. I will now plug an external microphone into the line input. This is a test of the Sony TC-110A using an external microphone. And you can see my voice on the external microphone swings the meter. And the recording quality should be a lot better now. So let's rewind and see how it sounds. Alright. I'll play it for you through the internal speaker, and then we'll do a direct capture. So we'll rewind back to about there and hit play. This is a test of the Sony model TC-110A cassette recorder from 1971, give or take a year. Using the built-in microphone, you can see the needle swinging to my voice there. And if I actually pick this thing up and put it over here, and I go back to where it was, now this is a test speaking to the recorder from across the room, some 6 or 8 feet away. I will now plug an external microphone into the line input. This is a test of the Sony TC-110A using an external microphone. And you can see my voice on the external microphone swings the meter. And the recording quality should be a lot better now. So let's rewind and see how it sounds. This is a test of the Sony model TC-110A cassette recorder from 1971, give or take a year. Using the built-in microphone, you can see the needle swinging to my voice there. And if I actually pick this thing up and put it over here, and I go back to where it was, now this is a test speaking to the recorder from across the room, some 6 or 8 feet away. I will now plug an external microphone into the line input. This is a test of the Sony TC-110A using an external microphone. And you can see my voice on the external microphone swings the meter. And the recording quality should be a lot better now. So let's rewind and see how it sounds. So there you go. So you can see the recording quality, especially when I use an external microphone, is just fantastic. I couldn't believe it when I heard it for the first time. Just simply incredible. Really, really nice. So this thing's obviously fantastic for recording and playing back dictation. But what about music? How does it do for music? Well, obviously this isn't a machine meant to record or play back music, not the least of which being it does have a fairly high wow and flutter specification of 0.3%. For comparison, my Iowa 80 F770 has a wow and flutter specification of 0.025%. So an order of magnitude more compared to that deck. But for the casual listener, this thing plays back music just fine. And I will demonstrate that. I have an Ace of Base cassette. So we'll just pop this out here. And we'll stick in our Ace of Base cassette. And actually I gotta fast forward to the song I want to demonstrate. And actually, while I'm fast forwarding the tape here, what helps this thing be an acceptable music cassette player is because the speed is actually accurate. Despite now running on a completely different set of belts, I haven't had to adjust the speed. It is actually, as far as my ears are concerned, spot on. It's actually accurate, and that's really surprising because shoebox cassette recorders and other portable cassette recorders meant for dictation, accurate speed of playback wasn't a big deal because these things were meant primarily to play back their own recordings. So the fact that this thing is actually accurate for the official speed of a compact cassette is quite impressive. And obviously this thing has an electronic servo control for the motor speed, because when it played on the original belts, which had gone all loose and stuff, the speed was accurate. And now on the new belts that I put in, which are nice and tight, the speed is still accurate. So there's obviously some electronic control of the motor happening there. And with those original capacitors, you know, almost 50 years old, the fact that it works as well as it does is still really nice. You can hear the wow and flutter, but like I said, for the casual listener, it's totally acceptable. Now, here's an interesting comparison. I just remembered that I still own this thing. It's the Sony TCM-323 cassette recorder. I forget what year this is from, but I made a video of this a few years ago. Really simple recorder. It's got a built-in microphone, no provisions for an external recording source, built-in speaker. So I figure, why not pit these two against each other? We'll see what the difference in recording quality is. Is this gonna have better recording quality than this, where being that this is, you know, 15 years old and this is almost 50 years old? Or is this gonna have the edge with its larger size and more high-end construction? I don't know. But I did a test recording on this unit, and then I made a test recording on the same tape with this unit with the built-in microphone, and I did a third test recording on this thing with an external microphone. And for this test, I want a neutral judge for playback, so I'm going to play back the tape in the IWA-AD F770, and I'm going to give you a direct hookup, and we'll see how the recording quality differs between these two units. This is a Sony model TCM-323 with the built-in microphone. This is the Sony TC-110A with the built-in microphone. This is the Sony TC-110A with an external microphone. And just for kicks, this is the IWA-AD F770 with no Dolby noise reduction. And this is the IWA-AD F770 with Dolby C noise reduction. Well, that's about all there is to show of the Sony model TC-110A cassette recorder from around 1971. I am really glad that I paid the $2 for this. You know, as you guys know, I've said it before, I love magnetic tape. I love magnetic audio recording, and I love magnetic video recording. But the problem is, with most of the equipment I own, I've become sort of spoiled over the years. You know, with my VHS VCRs, for example, I own two 4-head hi-fi stereo VCRs, and that's really all that I would ever want for a VCR. I would never consider getting a, for example, 2-head mono VCR if I saw one in a thrift store, with the exception of if it was something really special or really vintage. Likewise, being lucky enough to own what's considered one of the greatest consumer-grade cassette decks ever made, I've become spoiled with that as well. And when it comes to portable cassette recorders, something I've always wanted for years and years is a Sony Walkman WM-D6C. It was a professional-grade Sony Walkman cassette recorder. It had Dolby B and C noise reduction, Type 2 and 4 cassette support, and I've always wanted one of those. Well, unfortunately, the prices just keep going up and up. You're going to pay a few $100 minimum for a decent working unit now, and if you don't have one that's decent working, you're going to pay a few $100 to send it off to a professional to get it serviced. And of course, if you buy one of the older ones now, bad capacitors are going to play into it. So I don't think I'll ever own one of those, unfortunately, unless I got super lucky and was like given one or something. Another one is the Sony TCD5. It was a larger portable professional grade cassette recorder, Dolby noise reduction. If I couldn't get a Walkman WM-D6C, I might want a TCD5. And it's the same story with those. The prices just keep going up because they're obviously getting rarer. Even though there were tons of them made, they're obviously becoming fewer and fewer on the used market. And once again, servicing them, it has to play into it, and you're going to once again pay a few $100 for a half-decent working unit. And I've sort of become spoiled with these things, you know, only wanting the very best for cassette recorders, Dolby noise reduction, Type 2 and 4 cassette support, stuff like that, and I never really, I sort of lost appreciation for basic recorders like this one. And owning this has restored that appreciation for basic cassette recorders that I had lost. As I said earlier in the video, I almost didn't consider buying this based on a horrible experience of another vintage cassette recorder I have, which I'm now going to look into getting rid of, just putting it up on eBay. And, you know, a recorder like this, no Dolby noise reduction, only Type 1 cassette support. And I sort of lost appreciation for, you know, the fun that you can still have with a recorder like this. And this thing has restored that in me because it's got great quality, it's very fun to use, it's very cool to use and very cool to have and even just look at, and it's still very high quality even if it's only a relatively basic machine. And yeah, not to mention, you know, a cassette recorder like this is so much simpler, easier to repair. There's no highly complex electronics like you're going to find in those professional grade recorders. So it's a lot less frustrating and a lot less expensive to find one of these and get it working okay. So yeah, I'm really glad that I've gotten to own and experience this, and I didn't have too much frustration getting it working well. I'm only worried now that I may have damaged the internal microphone because it's got that weird high-pitched warble to it when you speak now. So that's kind of unfortunate if that's my fault. But otherwise, the rest of the unit works great, as you've seen today, and yeah, it's really fun to use, and I'm really glad I have it. It's sort of restored an appreciation for cassette recorders like this in me. Oh, I haven't even shown this yet. It came with this vinyl case, which is sort of falling apart. I'll have to see about gluing the pieces back together. But you can see it says Sony on it, and it's got the printing, well, it's faded now, but it's got the printing for the transport controls on it, and holes for the level meter and the microphone and the tape counter and everything. So I got that with it too, which is kind of nice. And I don't think I ever mentioned, there was a follow-up to this model, another revision. It was called the TC-110B. Exactly the same physically. I don't know what they changed in the TC-110B. Presumably they made some sort of electronic improvement to it, but I don't know what that would have been. So anyway, that's all there is to show for this thing. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.